was just to casually look around in terms of what's going on out here in Las Vegas, there are no jobs. Most of them happen to be in the public safety arena, but there are no jobs. So exactly what would we be doing in addition to creating another burden for those that are already out there that would have to bring them in and share their food and so on. I highly value liberty, but not to the extent to where we would be creating the public problem, because many of them would go out and reoffend. You don't have any money, you don't have a job, you don't have any place to live. At some point in time, you're going to kick into survival mode. That's certainly not everybody, and I can't give you a percentage. But I can tell you what, there's not just a possibility of recidivism, there's a probability in this current environment. So to call for the release of inmates just for the release of inmates, I don't see the value to society other than creating residual issues with additional crime, a lack of supervision, and I'm not trying to talk for my partners here in probation and parole commission, but I will share with you, following the logic of just releasing because it would be safer, I would add safer for who? I don't have an issue, and I don't want an issue within the prison. I certainly am very interested in sentencing reform, criminal justice reform, but I think there's a right way, and we can't just seize this as an opportunity. Once again, speaking for myself, can't seize this as an opportunity to further or to hasten sentencing reform or criminal justice reform if we don't have a plan. I would be hard-pressed to get a job if I were to lose mine right now. What would be the chances of success for many of these people? And we just heard from many people here, those resources are scarce to none. So that's my comment. But in terms of looking at the report in general, I looked at most of the topics, and quite frankly, I will tell you, we're actually doing most of those, and we have embraced most of those. But once again, I don't want to make the enemy the perfect or the good. We've done the things that we believe are important, and I believe our statistical analysis is concise. We're making our own sanitizer. We're dealing with cleaning and disinfecting on a regular basis. We've stopped the vast majority of our movement. We've stopped our medical copays and wait lists. We've acquired and are acquiring the appropriate testing equipment, and we have the ability to control who enters our space. Well, anyway, those are my comments. I would hope those weren't too strong, but I feel a need to share that. What do you do when they're all out? Where exactly do they go? Who monitors them? Who feeds them? Who pays? Who gives them money? Where does all this happen? Just to release people with no plan, I think is harmful. And then on top of that, the victims would have to deal with the fact that many of those folks that got out early would not, in many respects, be supervised. So anyway, that is my comment for now, and I'm available for any further comment.
Okay, thank you, Director. Chief Carpenter, any comments or observations?
Hi, I just have a few comments. First of all, I want to echo everything that Director Daniels eloquently stated. I also wanted to echo the comments of Ms. Moll about the victims. I think that's an important piece that we shouldn't forget. Also, with the technical violations in the SAFER plan, I think that home probation is doing what we can to do better in this area. And the last thing regarding older individuals, I just want everyone in this group to know that 2 weeks ago, the Nevada Highway Patrol lost a sergeant to someone who committed a crime and he was over 60. And so I won't belabor the point. I just need everyone to understand that sometimes age doesn't matter when it comes to committing a crime. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Escada, any comments regarding the proposed plan?
Yeah, I just want to circle back to what was the comment at the very beginning. This is what's been deemed to be best practices by a bipartisan group of individual experts that support this plan, regardless of what side of the aisle they are on. If you want to call pro law enforcement versus pro the human rights or ACLU side, everyone it's a safer plan. It's not a best plan, but it is the best practices that are being recommended, not only for our state, but across the country. And I just think we need to keep that in mind. We all have our agendas and we all have our areas that we feel that we're experts in, but this is a document and a suggested plan that has been recommended by a bipartisan group of experts as the best practices to keep our communities as safe as possible.
Mr. Hicks, I don't know if I called on you, and if I didn't, I apologize. Are you still on the phone?
I am, thank you. No apology necessary. I figured you were coming around sooner or later. So I don't have a lot of comments on it. I think it presents good recommendations for all of us to consider in doing our individual roles in this whole criminal justice process. I don't know that a wholesale adoption of everything in there is something I would necessarily advocate for, but I do think there are good recommendations that we need to use, balancing it against our resources, victims, public safety, and actual threat. I was very pleased to hear, like all of you, about the prison and that there are no reported cases yet, and all the steps that the director has taken. I commend him for that. Likewise, I can report in Washoe County we have no incidents in our jail, no positive cases, and a significantly reduced jail population, largely in line with some of the recommendations in the SAFER plan. And so I guess my 2 cents is there are some good recommendations there that all of us should take into consideration in doing our individual roles in trying to balance against other interests that are important to consider.
Assemblywoman Nguyen?
It's Nicole. She had to step and handle court, so she wanted me to let you know that in case you called on her.
Thank you, Senator. Were there any comments or suggestions you had with respect to the SAFER plan at this point?
Yeah, just a few. And some of this is, there may be some individuals on the phone who can't answer some of the questions. One of the things that I agree with, but have sort of a question on, is the medical cost and waiver of copays. I don't know what that looks like currently in our prisons and jails, but obviously one of my questions would be, what would be the fiscal impact of that if we were to adopt that? If it's not something that we already do, how much of a fiscal impact to the state budget are we looking at? And then sort of along some of the same lines, there were some recommendations to liberalize overtime restrictions and then the sources of supplemental staff. And so kind of in the same vein, what the fiscal impact of that might look like for NDOC and for any of the jails that might be increasing overtime. And then for the supplemental staff, especially with regard to NDOC, because of legislation that was passed last session, and I know they're not in bargaining yet, but there are certainly some parameters for state employees. And I'm just wondering if we see that there might be any issues with recommending those things, and then again, just the fiscal impact of that. So those are maybe more some questions from that angle. And I don't know if it's better to kind of answer some of those. I've got some other things that I wanted to just touch on as well.
Do you mind covering those now?
Sure, yeah, that's totally fine. So in there, it also says that there would be alternatives for incarceration for pretrial defendants who have not been adjudicated as a risk to public safety. And so, again, while generally I think we're all of the mindset that if you're not going to be a risk to public safety, if there's not a risk that you're not going to appear for court, we would want to make sure that we're not over incarcerating pretrial defendants. But I do think, and specifically and especially because of some new guidelines that exist for pretrial release, I guess what would that mean if we were to adopt that? The language of adjudicated as a risk to public safety, how does that interplay with the current status of the law? And then the alternative, of course, is to utilize house arrest and electronic monitoring. That's the same for, I believe, individuals who are serving sentences in jail and then also released from prison for the house arrest and electronic monitoring portion. And I guess I'm wondering what the capacity is for us to put additional individuals on house arrest or electronic monitoring. That seems to be an ongoing issue, that there aren't enough electronic monitoring devices, there aren't enough house arrest officers. How are we going to be monitoring people in the field while keeping in compliance with additional, I guess, case loads for those officers and those who are supervising them, and how we're going to comply with social distancing and allowing them to do their jobs if we're going to be impacting this. And then I think just some of the more technical pieces of the parameters for release from prison, we're talking about nonviolent offenders. In the suggestions in the SAFER plan, it says anybody within 6 months of release should be immediately released. And so I'm just wondering what other parameters we would be looking at with respect to release from prison. Like what constitutes nonviolent? Are we talking about commuting sentences? Are we talking about the pardon board sort of taking that over? And I just think a little more clarity from our part, if we're going to be recommending that, would be helpful. The other piece was they talked about a technical violation. So no new crimes were committed. Anybody who was on supervision but had committed a technical violation. I'm just wondering if we would be defining that similar to how we, I think, defined it last session with what constitutes a technical violation. One example I think of is if somebody, for example, was supposed to have no contact with the victim, but then was revoked from probation or parole for having contact with the victim, is that a technical violation? And where we're drawing those distinctions. I think the same questions about elderly and those at risk. Is it just a blanket across the board if you're elderly or at risk? Are we talking about individuals who might be elderly or at risk, but who also fall under the definition of, sex offenders or violent crimes? That would be concerning to me. And then the supervision piece where they want to release everyone from supervision if they've done 3 years or more. I guess my question is just more so, would that be on just a blanket across the board? If you're on supervision for 3 years and you've been compliant, we're going to release you. Would there be some parameters to that? Because some of the individuals who are on longer supervision tend to be folks who are being supervised for a sex offense or for a violent offense. And so I guess I would just want some clarity on that.
Okay, thank you, Senator. All great questions. Let me share with the commission some thoughts I had on not only on this, but also in the context of the Sentencing Commission's authority and statutory duties and responsibilities. I think we need to be mindful that the Sentencing Commission as an entity doesn't really have any authority to compel or adopt regulations that are enforceable on anyone. It is a recommending body. And so, for example, if we thought it was prudent to address on, say, the first major page dealing with recommendations under legal visitation, alternatives to physical visitation, if we thought that recommendation was a prudent thing to do, then we could recommend it, and the person who would be implementing it would be the Department of Corrections. Similarly, with respect to the medical copay, subject to the questions posed by Senator Canizero, that too would be a recommendation, and the entity that would be implementing it would be a combination of the Department of Corrections and the Division of Parole and Probation, who might supervise somebody if they were getting out. There are a number of other questions, good questions, the Senator and others have asked that I think probably requires some additional information. I mentioned also pretrial. Those issues involve the sheriffs who supervise those jails and the limited jurisdiction courts who are responsible for making pretrial detention determinations, and the district court judges. So I think it's important to gain their input for purposes of recommendations. One thing that the commission could do, if it thought was appropriate, was to recommend either to the governor some action that he take, or to the director, or to Chief Carpenter, or to Director Daniels. But one of the things that I was concerned about has to do with some of the general conversation about releasing inmates, whether it be those who have existing parole grants that are subject to trying to meet certain conditions, or whether it be in a category of nonviolent offenders, so-called, that would be released. Any of those release mechanisms under our Constitution are going to fall within the authority of the Pardons Board. And as you all know, that consists of the governor, the attorney general, and the 7 justices on the Supreme Court. So once again, while this commission's input, suggestions, and ideas would be valuable for consideration by the Pardons Board if it were to convene to consider some of these alternatives, it's still ultimately, as far as I can tell, unless you get into some of the special programs that Assemblyman Nguyen appropriately identified, isn't really going to take place in the absence of some action taken by the Pardons Board. So it seemed to me that one of the things that this commission could do is urge the governor to convene the Pardons Board. He is the only one who really can do that as the chair of the Pardons Board. So that might be something that could be recommended today. I do want to also mention that we have a meeting scheduled in 2 weeks on the 29th of April. And with the exception of some aspects of the SAFER plan that people may wish to make a motion about today, we could explore some of the questions that have been raised, get some answers to those and some additional input, and further vet the plan on April the 29th. Looking at the agenda for April 29th, it is primarily to take a look at, I think, Ms. Gonzalez, we have something like 4 or 5 or 6 applications for funding for our implementation programs, and I wanted to have the commission vet those and make recommendations to pass those on to the Bureau of Justice Assistance so we can begin getting that money into those agencies' hands. But we can certainly continue our discussion and continue to vet some of these matters in the plan, and all of it, of course, as we go forward. So that's sort of my long-winded reaction to all of this. We don't have to take any action on anything today. We can take some action on some of these matters today. We certainly as well could make any other recommendations that the commission would like to advance. With that said, I want to return back to Dr. Salisbury because I really appreciate her leadership in bringing this forward and give her an opportunity to react to some of the comments that were made, including mine, and then see if she has any additional remarks or suggestions at this point. Dr. Salisbury?
Thank you, Chair. Hardesty appreciated. Yeah, I appreciate the comments that have been made, and this is precisely, what I was hoping. I think we just need to discuss these specific recommendations, particularly for our own context here in Nevada. I wouldn't expect that a plan would wholesale be adopted across the board necessarily without really thinking about our situation in particular, given that we don't have any inmates at this point or incarcerated people who tested positive. Of course, the concern is still there that there may be some who are asymptomatic and still spreading it, and I think it's our responsibility to anticipate a possible outbreak in one of the facilities. I also just want to mention that, I don't want to focus specifically only on NDOC in terms of custody populations, but also remind everyone about the thousands of incarcerated people who are in our local jails and in rural jails as well. So it's my opinion that I think we need to maybe come to some consensus about whether or not we feel like we need to move forward in discussing potentially releasing incarcerated people given the situation that we're in. I don't know that we need to vote on that or take action, but I think I'd like to hear people's sort of reactions about the specific recommendations about releasing folks given our situation in Nevada. I'm personally of the opinion that it would be safer for staff and for inmates to be released, even if they don't have a place necessarily to go, because it gives people more autonomy and freedom of choice. If there's any possible way to give incarcerated people a choice as to whether or not they want to release, I would advocate for that. I think if it's possible to reduce the number of people incarcerated on behalf of the correctional staff at NDOC and our jails, jail facilities, it theoretically should help their staffing and the likelihood of it further spreading. I also am very, very mindful as an expert on offender risk assessment in thinking about the plan and implementing this across the board, what it would really take for NDOC and parole and probation and others to really understand who poses a public safety threat and who doesn't. We do have the Nevada risk assessment tool that both agencies use, and not sure that Las Vegas Metro or other agencies use that tool, but these are going to be some of the questions that I'm anticipating coming up in terms of the level of risk that people pose, and have a number of comments that I'll save for when that discussion does happen. My only other sort of add to the SAFER plan is to consider pregnant people who are incarcerated at Florence McClure, as well as CCBC and our other local jail facilities across the state, and considering the fact that they may not be necessarily vulnerable as it turns out, or as it relates to COVID in terms of their medical needs, but to be thinking about pregnant people and the women who are incarcerated at Florence McClure and the things that we need to be doing on their behalf as well. I just haven't heard a lot about that population today. So I'm open to more discussion on it. I'm open to wrapping up, but I did think maybe we needed to take a step back given our context and what we've heard from Director Daniels about, whether or not we really feel like, do we want to be proactive about trying to release individuals? And then if we have that decision made, where are sort of the release valves? And it certainly sounds like it's with the parole board and the governor in terms of those release mechanisms. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doctor. Have you thought about as one of the release valves the pardons board, and whether that's something the pardons board is going to do what the pardons board does, but a large number of folks who would be released under something other than the statutes that we've identified during the course of this meeting, I think is largely going to have to come from that group. And it's potentially a cumbersome effort I wonder if the commission should ask that be convened now, or is that something you think we should defer on?
It's my opinion that the sooner we get our stakeholders involved in the conversation to just sort of see our situation, I think, you know, we need to discuss what entities exist to be able to legally release. I know that there are some other scholars out there who are starting to compile the different mechanisms that and power that governors have in terms of commuting sentences and other areas for release. And again, I am not advocating that we do anything necessarily wholesale, but to just think about what areas you know, we do have for release. And you know, I'm of the opinion that we should take that proactive stance, but I'm certainly one commissioner and would want to make sure that we have consensus on that from the commissioners.
So let me ask again, I'll canvass the commissioners to react to Dr. Salisbury's observations and see whether or not there's an appetite among the commission members to urge for release of inmates. But it's not a wholesale release. It's starting to address a plan of release of individuals and what that plan consists of would be further debated by the Sentencing Commission. And that, do I correctly characterize what you were saying, Dr. Salisbury?
Absolutely, not a wholesale, but just that we continue the discussion and the debate, because I think it's a moot point if we don't have consensus to take this proactive approach. You know, it makes sense to me to have that solidified.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Tyler Garner, do you have any comments, observations? Again, no one's committing to a vote. It's really just kind of a canvas to see if there's a general interest in pursuing this subject matter further.
I would love to pursue it further. I want to know, I'm pleased to see that a number of the recommendations in the report are already occurring, and believe as it relates to the compassionate release or the implications around early release and supports in the community, that we should do our due diligence to ensure that if we are going to support that approach, that there's a divine process in place that ensures cross-agency coordination. But as it relates to some of the other practices, including even ensuring the calls and things of that nature with family, I'm pleased to see that much of that is already underway, and that where there is a need to ensure a safety net for some of the vulnerable populations, that we do our due diligence there if we're going to support that effort.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Story?
The answer is yes. I would like us to look at this option and ultimately be able to make a recommendation to the Pardons Board. One question that I have, at least for me, be helpful is what number are we looking at? Who would provide that number? I'm guessing it's the Department of Corrections, and what standard would that number be based on? How many people are eligible for compassionate release? And then also within the jails, as Dr. Salisbury was referring.
So I don't have the answer, but I do want to offer this comment, Mr. Story. The commission and members of the commission can certainly offer suggestions about this topic, but at the end of the day, to the extent that we're dealing with people incarcerated in the Nevada Department of Corrections who are seeking early releases, the category of defendants or inmates that would be considered are going to be determined, I think, by the Pardons Board. They're going to assess this. Now, I'm sure that the Pardons Board would welcome input from this commission to categorize people. I hate to use it that way, but to create categories or identify. But I think the commission needs to offer suggestions and ideas about who might be considered. You saw from the ACLU letter that they started with the category of people that were mentioned in Chief Carpenter's comments. Those for whom parole has already been granted, but there's some impediment, either on the part of their conditions or some conditions that perhaps could be waived, or agreements could be signed by parolees who could get out immediately. I mean, that's already been quantified, I think, and it's somewhere, if I understood her latest remarks, between 200 and 400 people. Now, whether they'd all be released or whether the parolees would agree to get out is a completely separate question. What tails would exist, all of those would be important considerations, I think, to the Pardons Board if they were to be involved in that process, and certainly to the Division of Parole and Probation. So it's a rather complex process, but I think the role of this commission is largely to help all of the actors who might have some role in all of this, identify who these people might be, and then we could get some numbers and so forth. But at the end of the day, whether they're granted any relief is going to really depend upon the decision makers as to whether they're satisfied that those people could be released without presenting a public policy risk, or a risk to victims, or a risk to themselves, for that matter, on a case-by-case basis. I don't know if you recall, or if members of this commission recall, but been almost a decade ago when the Pardons Board, at my urging, considered releasing, because we were very overcrowded at that time, inmates who were subject to ICE holds and who were very close to the expiration of their term. And there were a number of those folks who had no criminal history. Their prison disciplines were minimal or non-existent, and ICE was prepared to deport them if they were released to their custody. And that process, I think, generated something like 9 or 10 releases at that time. But I can tell you the Pardons Board painstakingly took 3 or 4 meetings and went through every one of those cases individually to make those decisions, and to assess the impact on the community, and individualize the determinations with respect to each of those defendants. And that would take quite a bit of time and effort, to the extent that sentences were even thought about being commuted. And they were commuted for specific conditions. In that instance, they were commuted for release to ICE. And then ICE could make the determination as to what was going to occur, generally deportation, in that example. So I don't know that we can really answer your question about who's eligible. I think the commission needs to offer suggestions about who might be eligible, and maybe we can quantify that. But I think the general question is whether the commission is interested in pursuing this subject matter, and as I understand it, you support that idea.
I do, and I appreciate that clarification. What I was trying to get at is how much time are we looking at before that data can be collected and either shared with the commission or presented to the Pardons Board for action. So is this something that could be done by the 29th, or are we talking about something that's not happening until June or July? So that was the nature of my inquiry.
Well, my suggestion is that if we want the Pardons Board to get involved, we need to ask them to start convening as soon as possible, because there's a tremendous amount of work for the Pardons Board to undertake. It's not a simple task by any means, and you've got 9 constitutional officers that are involved in that process, and it pose additional challenges, frankly, for the staff that has to provide reports and information about those folks. So probably the best approach, if we thought this was a prudent thing to do, is to have these commissions and boards working in tandem and at the same time. Otherwise, you're right. I mean, by the time you work through all of this at the commission level and you make recommendations, then the Pardons Board has to start that process all over again.
My response is still yes.
Okay, well, thank you. Mr. Ponder?
Yes, thank you so much. I do think would be very worthwhile to continue these conversations, but I'm going to circle back to some comments that Director Daniels had made, and I based that off of being in the vein of the reentry population. You know, a vast majority of our clients who have been released, who were able to get up and running and find jobs and things of that nature, you know, the vast majority of them have lost their jobs. So my question is, you know, as the director had pointed out, what are we releasing them to? With the lack of employability and the very limited amount of supportive services, although some, you know, will we be able to handle the magnitude of what it is that is about to release? I would like to have a conversation, as Chief Carpenter had discussed, you know, what would be those processes in place, right? I think it would be important to make sure that we have those processes so we can take a look at individuals to ensure that when they're being released, that they have a place to go, and that those supportive services that would be there for them. So certainly interested in having those conversations. Just very concerned about what it is that they're going to be coming home to. But would be very excited to participate in whatever conversations that we would be having, lending our expertise in this subject to the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Neighbors?
Yes, well, I would echo the concern about talking about what we are releasing these folks to, but I think it's worth it to recognizing all of the complexities involved to have the conversation, to consider the details of who we're talking about and whether or not there is a mechanism by which this would be a useful process, helpful process that would actually make things safer. So I would support having the conversation as you discussed, Justice Hardesty, with that recognition that it's putting together information for a recommendation to the Pardons Board, and that we just need to collect more details to do that.
Okay. Ms. Moll?
Yes, I definitely think for non-violent offenders, it's something to look at. I again want to echo what Mr. Ponder and others have been saying. I'm just going to take a leap out there and guess that out of the commission, I'm probably the only one that's on food stamps or been on food stamps recently, and I don't know how it's going for all of y'all, but for some of us, trying to skip basic necessities is really difficult right now. If you can get meat or eggs on each side of town, they limit you to one or two, so you have to go to the store every day or every other day just to get basics. To be able to pay utilities or rent or things right now is really hard for those of us that work in the gig economy. So to not have systems and things in place and assistance in place for people that are coming into, for lack of a word, apocalyptic type of environment, I think we're just setting them up to fail or to reoffend or to have them get a third, fourth strike that's going to put them in jail longer. So I think that anyone that's coming out, we have to have resources in place. We have to have things in place for them and assistance and some kind of footprint or map, or really we as a state are just setting them up to reoffend, and not at their own necessarily fault, because I'm in survival mode right now. I'm doing what I can and what I have to do in order just to feed myself. So to put that on these individuals that have not been in society and that have not been in the mix of it this far, and to just throw them in the deep end, it seems cruel to me if we don't have a plan for them when they come out, if we don't have a roadmap for them to come out, aside from just putting them at risk of getting COVID, but also just being able to survive or end up back in prison or end up back for something worse than what they were before. So I hope we'll take that into consideration. I hope that not just us, but everyone in the state will take that into consideration when we're having these conversations. Absolutely, if we can make people safer by letting them out early if they're not a violent offender, but also making sure that there's a plan in place so that they don't end up in a worse place because we were trying to do good and by that doing harm.
Thank you, Ms. Small. Well spoken. Mr. McCormick?
I certainly think it's incumbent on the Sentencing Commission to explore this issue further, and like everyone has indicated, potentially help the Pardons Board with sort of classification and what groups we should look at. And I also am very sensitive to the concerns about re-entry without, support and a plan, but I think we, as a group, need to continue to explore this.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Marsh?
Thank you, Justice Hardesty. I think I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective because I've been dealing for the last month plus with clients who are sitting in prison who are terrified. To them, it's a matter of life or death. And so I think the quicker we can do this for them, especially the nonviolent offenders, the elderly offenders, people who are close to the end of their sentences, the people that are identified in the SAFER plan. And I would like to commend Dr. Salisbury for bringing that up before the board. For them, any delay is a potential. I don't want to be overly dramatic and say death sentence, but that's the way they look at it. They are really worried about what could happen. I'm talking about people who are in their 70s, who have asthma, who are getting cancer treatment or treatments for other medical conditions that make them susceptible to both catching COVID-19 or if they get it, to being one of those folks who is going to end up in an ICU. So I think there's two parts of this. The first is I certainly will bite and take Justice Hardesty up on his thought of that today we make a recommendation to the governor to convene the Pardons Board to get that started while we take a couple of weeks to try to figure out if we have any recommendations for them for categories of folks to consider. And then second, I think this is something that, I'm afraid this situation will be in front of us for a long time. But as we start to get past it, we should be thinking about making recommendations for legislation. Even the federal government in the First Step Act has changed their compassionate release policy where judges to make individual decisions to let people out. And we need to have something better, I think, than just having the Pardons Board. But that's long term. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Mr. Logan?
Thank you, Justice Hardesty. I don't think this is I want to start off with it. It could easily, I think we should continue to debate it, continue to move this forward, but this is not just a now problem. This is an isolated incident medically, but this situation will continue, and things that we do now, we have to be able to continue to do moving forward and advance it throughout, because the fear factor of everything, the fear factor of housing, of food, of survival, every one of us has been touched by it differently. And Ms. Mull, you're not alone. Thankfully, my childhood, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for a lot of those problems. So there's things there. But there are people out there that are coming out of mental health programs right now that are trying to be phased out, but there's not a single place for them to live, that are taking new clients, new people. There's so many different aspects of this, and yes, we have to debate it, but think of it as not just what our temporary problem is, but that cascading event of what's going to be the next problem, or why should these people be treated differently under these set of circumstances than the people a year ago or 5 years ago or 5 years into the future. I think it's incumbent upon us to try to look at it with all of our minds and put our best plan forward and be able to tweak that moving forward. So I encourage us to continue this discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Logan. Ms. Jones-Brady?
Thank you. I think we should definitely be proactive in thinking about these things. I would also be in favor of us recommending to the governor that he hold or convene a pardons board between now and the next one, which I think is in, did someone say is in June? And so if there's able to be one sooner, and perhaps not just for the next pardons board, but in general, are we able to create any working groups of the sentencing commission that may include people outside of the commission to bring people together to start really talking about what services are out there, who can help, where's the money, just all of those things. And so that would be my thoughts, because I agree, I don't remember who said it, but if we let them out without any supportive services, that is cruel. And not only that, is that it will create bitterness and resentment in the people who are being released. If they're released with the typical, is it $20 or $40, and if that will create some bitterness in them as well. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you for those comments. Mr. Emily?
I certainly think we should continue to pursue all avenues. I don't think we should take anything off the table right now. I think the SAFER plan has a lot of well thought out recommendations that could be applied. Including, I think we should request the governor convene a pardons board, but I don't think anything should be taken off the table right now. And as mentioned before, I think time is of the essence with this, because we've heard exponentially a number of times, and if we have a couple of outbreaks, then we know how quickly that's going to grow. And so I think time is of the essence. I think we need to make sure that we act on this as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hicks?
I don't have much to add, Justice Hardesty. There's just a few things kicking around in my head as we talk about this, and all our lives have changed profoundly because of this, and we are looking at things that we've never had to look at before, and I commend everybody for that. I want us to be sure not to lose sight of a lot of the proactive measures that have already happened. Director Daniels, how he talked about how he's handling it within the Department of Corrections. Chris Dorico talking about how they quashed multiple warrants for technical violations. My Washoe County Jail, the population last year at this time was 1,200 people. Last week it was below 700. And that's because of what law enforcement's doing, what the prosecutors are doing in conjunction with defense attorneys to minimize the risk. I'm not saying I want to take this off the table. I think a debate is important about it. But when you start talking about things such as early release and letting people out who are serving sentences that were given to them in a court of law for something that they did, whether it be they failed at probation and they ended up having to go to prison, or they did something severe enough, or their history suggested severity enough that they were put in prison, to turn around and release them, that needs to be a healthy debate. And I personally think it will take a great deal of time to narrow it down to who fits and who doesn't in those categories. Especially, I agree with what Mr. Imlay said, time is of the essence. And then I can't help but agree with everybody that said, what are we releasing them to? That is a very real concern right now. And homelessness is a very vulnerable population, which again can cause this to spread exponentially. And so I don't know that I'm taking a position. I guess I'm saying it needs to be thoroughly debated and discussed. And And I don't know if that actually makes the Pardons Board exercising their own statutory abilities take longer by waiting for input from us than perhaps just going forward and doing what they feel they may need to do, the 9 members. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I do think we have to remember we've done some extraordinary steps that are helping immensely. And when we start getting through talking about releasing people when there aren't even positive cases yet, that's where I start, feeling a little uncomfortable about public safety and victims' rights. And so I'll rest on that. I know there's going to be a lot more discussion about all of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hicks. Thoughtful comments, appreciate it. Mr. Tirico, anything you'd like to say, Chairman, about continuing the conversation on this topic?
Yes, certainly this topic, in my opinion, needs to be continued to be vetted out. Some of my thoughts on here is I know the term a non-violent offender, we're considering those, but I can tell you many times the parole board sees an individual who might be for let's just say, a sales of narcotics case, but that doesn't mean the 5 incidents before that were not for a violent offense. So one of the things to consider would be, are we talking about the instant offense only or history of violence with particular offenders? I think that should come into the fold of discussion here. Another comment, and I think Senator Cannizzaro brought this up earlier, was with regard to the supervision terms and 3 years or more under supervision and release. So, well, we all know we have many individuals who are under supervision for lifetime. So we throw those individuals into the mix if they met a 3-year. We already have statutory requirements in order for those people and how they can petition to be released early, but just something else to bring up. I wanted to comment that, this plan here, and which was put out on and sent to this commission on April 9th, was a list of recommendations in here, and it's globally because every state or federally is going to have different rules and regulations with which they have to deal with. But the nice thing, in my opinion, is many of these things in here that are recommendations have already been put into place where they can through not only the division, but the Department of Corrections and the parole board prior to even receiving this thing. So they are recommendations to move forward, and I think that has been done in the state and is moving forward that way in Nevada. So with that, I see it to look at it a couple of ways. Could we kind of move forward with the stakeholders here and to try and implement as many of these, or to work within the confines of statute to continue along with some of these recommendations, try and come up with some creative alternatives to implement some more or see what else can be done with it. And I would say once we reach that point, or if not, then I would say, then I think we should look to the Pardons Board in order to make those other calls. One last comment on this is that I know we keep talking about people that are close to the end of their sentence, looking at them to have them possibly be released, but those people that are also close to their sentence expiration would have undoubtedly previously seen the parole board and likely had been deemed not so good of a candidate for whatever reason on there. So those candidates that you might see that get close to an end of their sentence, we might see just that there are certain reasons as to why they may not be good candidates, or at least the Pardons Board may see that, and they may see otherwise as well. But certainly individuals are afforded the opportunity to go before the board, some on many occasions. And so once we get back to that Pardons Board, taking a look and reviewing these cases, if that's the route that we go, which ultimately I don't think is a bad call there. I don't necessarily see that they might be the cream puffs, so to speak, because more of those would have already been granted initially, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for those insights that are very helpful. Director Daniels, would you like to have the commission continue this discussion about early or other types of releases? And would you be in a position to provide suggestions to the commission to answer some of the questions that have been raised by commissioners about types of individuals that could be considered?
That's an interesting way of putting that out there. I am always in favor of further discussion about anything. I think fruitful debate, engaged debate can only make us better. But I think along with that, we still have to remember our public obligation. I heard some comments, and I'm going to just bring them up briefly, and it is clearly not my intent to offend, so that typically will follow with a statement. I'll give an example. Individuals speaking of how afraid they are in this fear. Well, where was that fear that's being expressed when they were in the commission of the crime? And where was that fear in reference to their victims of those crimes? And so, yes, this may be a now moment. We have a crisis, a global, a pandemic is a global epidemic. But I would say this, both sides need to be weighed, and I'm very comfortable with having that. Also, in terms of our responsibility to the citizens of the state, I am responsible, along with many others here, on preparing these individuals for their eventual reentry back into society. I've partnered with literally anyone and everyone that has an interest in the furtherance of getting these guys prepared to release and women to release, whether it be additional jobs, whether it be some training, whether it be vocational training, you name it, no matter what. I'm 100% in. But to release a bunch of people to the streets with no resources, I think there would be some societal harm. And so there's the one basic question that I always ask. And the question is, what is the action imperative? Why now, I guess, is another way of saying it. We talk about a lot of terms. Why now? Well, is it really the public safety? Is it really the safety of the inmates? Why now? There are some other people doing it. Great for them. But our situation may be somewhat different from what others are experiencing. We don't have a perfect system. But I would love to have that conversation, though, that extend to not just what now, because I don't see the urgency as of right now, although it may arise, and I may be convinced, but I'm always up for that conversation. You can count me in, but I believe in being very transparent and expressing to each and every one how important it is for us to look at the complete picture, not just a narrow perspective. So, Justice, I just want to say thank you and the rest of the group for even being here having this conversation. I will, quite frankly, throw my name in the hat for further conversation. But that would be the extent of it. And just, I want to have that debate, and I want to be able to express an opinion as a corrections professional. Thank you, sir.
I'd like to follow up on that opinion, Director, because I think it's an important question you pose. On the one hand, it has been suggested that the Commission look at this for the purpose of being proactive and avoiding a calamitous situation that develops maybe starting tomorrow or maybe starting 2 weeks from now. And certainly, having seen the criminal justice system since I've been a judge and a lawyer, things don't move very fast. We tend to operate at glacial speed. My point about this is, while we are blessed with your leadership and your success, I'm concerned about the why now. Is the answer to that is just being proactive against any risks in the future. So the question I have for you, and you may not be in a position to answer it today, is could the prison benefit from releases even just in the group that Chief Carpenter mentioned? And would that assist in improving, or I should say reducing, the risks of your staff members and other inmates being subjected to this disease and creating some potential security and budget benefits for NDOC? You follow that question?
Yes, Chief, I'm sorry, yes, Justice, I do follow your question. Generically, the question is, would I benefit from an inmate reduction? Absolutely, there's never an issue with that. Fewer inmates avail everyone to additional opportunities, there's less waiting lists, it's safer for my staff. So the answer is yes. As it relates specifically to COVID, I'm just of the, I want to avoid opinion. My background tells me, though, that I have to look at the residual of what I release back into the community. I am not solely responsible, but I am that handoff from paying debts to society to putting people back in with the help of my partners, of which many are here today. I take that seriously, and I get it. I want us to do well. I want us to make the best decisions, not my decision, but the best decision, which is, and I understand I'm a part of this group, so a reduction in my inmate population will always benefit. That is, if anyone were to tell you different, I'm really wondering how they could support that statement. However, but there's our responsibility and duty to society, and more specifically the citizens of the state of Nevada.
Of course. Well, thank you very much, Director. I appreciate those observations. Chief Carpenter, what are your thoughts about going forward?
Well, I'd like to go back to you asked for suggestions on who should be considered, and going back to Mr. Story's question, on April 10th, there was 398 people on our past parole eligibility list, and so those people have already been granted parole, and for a variety of reasons are not getting out at the moment, and so those are the people that we could start with. That's my suggestion, and I think that it's very good to discuss this and truly vet it, but I am with the group that it makes me nervous to try to release people and the resources are just not there. So that's my 2 cents.
Great. I'd like to follow up, if I might, Chief Carpenter, for persons who have not been directly involved in having to make those difficult decisions to find resources and support services for someone seeking parole. There's nothing like going case by case, maybe not by name, but going case by case. Here's examples of the kinds of problems we're running up against with these 398 people. And I think it might be worthwhile to include that as part of the discussion. There may be folks in this group who have family support, maybe have some conditions that could be waived. I don't know of anybody else besides the Pardons Board who could waive those conditions. Maybe you know of some other alternatives. But you might also have some folks here who have an opportunity to sign the parole agreement and proceed. And that would provide some release as well. But I think in every one of these instances, even though parole's been granted, we have to ask the question that was posed by Director Daniels early on. What are we releasing them to? And as Ms. Mull said, are we setting someone up for failure? So I think these are issues that could be applied to this group. It's a great suggestion. I appreciate that. And maybe we could figure out a way with the director's assistance and your assistance, Chief, to demonstrate that at our next meeting of the Sentencing Commission, what this looks like, what are some of the offenses, what are the details that are involved, what are some of the conditions that are restricting release. I mean, these are people who we say, oh, well, these can get out. All they got to do is just leave or sign a document or something. It's not that easy. And so I think we need to address this group and see what some of the problems are and debate that further. Did you have any additional comments, Chief, beyond what you referenced and based on my comments?
The only, and yes, we can do that at the next meeting, thank you. The only comment I had also is, Mr. Story asked what, how many inmates, the category that was the largest, and there, at the time this was submitted, there were 66 inmates, or 17% that didn't submit a viable plan, or the investigation was denied. And so to answer your question, Mr. Story, that could be a whole slew of issues, but that's something that parole and probation, that we have control over. And so usually when they have a non-viable plan, sometimes we get an address that doesn't exist. Sometimes they say they want to stay with their mom or dad, and the mom and dad say no. There's all kinds of things that could happen. Makes sense?
And I think those are examples of what the commission needs to hear from.
I'm sorry, this is just something that I didn't step in. I know I stepped out during my time that was called. I had a court appearance I had to make. So I had blue jeans going twice in my house, but is there any way I can say something just really briefly?
Well, of course. I'm glad you rejoined us. I was going to get to you and Senator Canizero, but you're welcome to go ahead and comment now, Assemblywoman.
I just want to say that I appreciate us bringing this to our attention sooner rather than later. You know, I see this as a humanitarian thing. I like the idea that we're all coming together because I think at the end of the day, we all have the same thing in mind. We want to make sure our community is protected. We don't want to end up with a situation where our prisons are petri dishes for potential outbreaks of the coronavirus, as we've seen potentially could happen in other places. So I think, you know, I do have concerns, obviously, about releasing people to unattainable, you know, situations that are just going to set them up for failure or create, you know, harm for our community and for the potential victims that are out there. I'm just concerned that, like, verifying some of these things like addresses or their plans for release are going to be even more inhibited because of, you know, the fact that people are in their homes or they're not reaching out or they're unable to take someone in, or because they have, you know, they're worried about their own safety. Like, I don't know if I would want anyone to come into my house, including an own family member that was coming from out of state. So, you know, I think that it's important to discuss that. I think it's also, you know, I do get concerned. You know, I don't want to release people into the community that are, you know, going to be a danger and re-victimize like victims in our community. And I think people should serve their debt and what they were sentenced to. However, on the flip side, I don't think someone should be penalized or in a dangerous situation where their life is at hand, and because they didn't take into consideration the victim, you know, when they committed their crime. So I don't think that's a proper punishment as well, to be in an unsafe situation. And we can see how fast this escalates. I appreciate everything that the Department of Corrections has been doing. And I'm glad to see that they've already implemented, as a part of their procedures and policies, some of the things that are outlined in the SAFER plan and the ACLU's plan and the Americans for Prosperity plan and all these various plans that have been like put forward. So I appreciate that we're on the forefront of those kind of, you know, protections. But at the same time, we also see how fast things can spread once it does, and we can assume that that potentially would happen. And I think having a plan in there, it may not be a perfect plan, but I think having something that we can turn to and use with some sort of uniformity to protect, you know, our community is important. So that's just all I want to say.
Okay, thank you. Vice Chair Callaway, are you still on the phone, and do you have any comments about continuing this conversation?
Yes, thank you, Justice Hardesty. I've been listening here to all the comments that have been made, and 100% agree with the comments that were made by Director Daniels. Also agree with the comments that were made by DA Hicks and Sheriff Logan. From a jail perspective, we didn't talk today about CCDC, but we started way back in March taking a very proactive and aggressive stance on this COVID issue. And as was stated by some of the other speakers, our numbers are way down. We currently have about 2,900 inmates in CCDC, and our capacity is normally around 4,000. We've got 865 people out on house arrest with ankle bracelets. We have told on the front end that no misdemeanor arrests are made unless they're mandatory arrests for domestic violence or DUI. A supervisor has to approve every person that's getting booked into the jail to make sure that people aren't getting booked in for very minor infractions. When they come in the jail, they get a significant health screening. Our staff gets screened when they come in. We have temperature stations set up to check the temperatures of inmates who are brought in, and also our staff. We've set up an EOC, and we have to look at this at Metro. We have to look at this. I could go through all the things we've done, but I won't because we've been here all day. We could look at this. We've done a lot of things similar to what the prisons have done, but from an LVMPD perspective, we got to look at it from both public safety aspect and health safety aspect. And our primary concern is the health and safety of our inmates, of our community, and also our employees and our staff. So we have to balance the whole issue, public safety and health safety. My big concern with some of the discussion today is the more we talk about it, the more questions pop up in my mind. Here at CCDC or LVMPD, we would love to see an empty jail, just like Director Daniels said. I'd love nothing more than to have an empty jail. We have been in constant dialogue with a number of associations and jails across the country to learn of best practices and adopt best practices. Again, we've been doing that since March. There was a University of Ohio put out a letter this morning that I just saw before the Sentencing Commission meeting that listed a number of best practices for jails, and a lot of them were in line with the SAFER recommendations. And in addition, I've heard some jurisdictions talking about releasing inmates on an honor system where they're expected to come turn themselves back in after the pandemic subsides, which I'm curious to see how that's going to play out. But we've got a number of jails just here in Clark County. We've got Henderson, City of Las Vegas. We've got North Las Vegas. City of Las Vegas is entirely a misdemeanor facility. So I think there's a lot of stakeholders here and a lot of discussion that needs to be had. Where I get nervous is what is the definition of who would be eligible? People say, well, misdemeanor offenders. But again, we have violent misdemeanor offenders. Again, it was said earlier, what's somebody's criminal history? Just because they're currently in on a property crime, but they've got a series of violent offenses in their past, maybe that's not a person that we want to release out. We talk about what is a vulnerable person or, compassionate release. But, the comment was made by Chief Carpenter about the guy that executed our trooper a couple weeks ago. And the fact of the matter is the Unabomber would be eligible for release if we were strictly looking at the vulnerable population. So I think there's a number of questions just there. What is the definition? Is it somebody that's a nonviolent offender that served 75% of their sentence, that appears before a board? Maybe the pardons board is the right board, maybe they're not. Again, more questions. What type of assessment is done on this person to determine they are or aren't a risk? Is the same risk assessment done that was mentioned previously? I think it's very healthy for us to have these discussions, and like Sheriff Logan said, I think we need to have a long-term plan so that if next year we find out this COVID thing is seasonal and we're back to square one, or there's a new COVID or some other disease around the corner and this becomes, I hate the term, but I'll use it, the new norm, then we have those long-term plans to address it. But I'm definitely open and willing to have those discussions, but I'm reluctant to just endorse one specific plan like the SAFER plan that was presented today. But that's my position.
Okay, Mr. Scotta?
Yes, I just want to thank everyone for our almost 5-hour meeting. Learned a lot today, and I kind of echo the comments of Mr. Marsh. I think that however the vehicle is, we should ask the Pardons Board to consider convening sooner than later. And I appreciate all that's been done in all our different correctional facilities, but I think we need to look at this also in the bigger picture of our societal goals. And really what we're seeing here is the SAFER plan is really, it to a degree, but not completely. It's AB 236, but looking at it from the back side instead of the front side. And we've adopted AB 236. It's going to come into play come July 1st. And now we're needing to start reinvesting in our justice system in these ways that lessen our prison. But we need to do it now. And why is that? It's because we're faced with this pandemic. And I appreciate all that's been being done by all of the different law enforcement agencies and the groups. But I think we have to look at this from a societal standpoint, and that our legislature passed AB 236 for a reason, and it was to lessen the amount of people that we have in prison and to have more of a treatment society, I guess you could call it, to a degree. And I think we need to have that in mind, and we need to approach this quickly. We're faced now with, we can't roll things out slowly. We have to move effectively and swiftly. And I think we can all look at the SAFER plan and sharpen down and narrow down the groups. And it's not just a, turn the key and open up the gates, but it's an educated and a thoughtful approach to addressing this worldwide pandemic, with keeping in mind the bill that passed, AB 236, and what the spirit of that was, and the goals that it had for our communities and our society. I think we need to move forward.
Senator Canizero, you haven't had an opportunity to speak on this issue yet. Senator Canizero, are you still?
It looks like she had to leave.
Pardon me?
It looks like she had to leave.
Oh, okay. And Assemblywoman Nguyen, that you missed on the first go around, I'll give you 2 comments on this one if you would like to add anything.
She actually just got kicked off, so I'm trying to get her back on.
Oh, is that right? Oh, my gosh. Assemblywoman Nguyen was disconnected from the call, so we're trying to get her back. So let's see if we can accomplish that, and then we'll take the next step in the meeting.
Justice Hardesty, this is Emily Salisbury. Just wondered if I could add one more comment.
Of course.
Thank you. So I wonder, I know John Ponder mentioned earlier, and Dr. Daniels kindly is allowing any commissioner who sort of is interested and available and able to follow protocol and to enter one of the institutions to sit in on the town halls. I wonder if it wouldn't be useful to do, in a similar vein, sort of some focus groups with incarcerated people to get their voice in on this discussion. I'm always quite mindful when we don't have those individuals present. Might also be helpful to have the voice of victims. Of course, we have public comment that's available in these commission meetings, and victims oftentimes can voice their opinion, and of course they're represented as well by, I think, every commissioner on this commission. But I do have concern in the inability for incarcerated persons to use their voice. I myself would be willing as a researcher to go into any facility and conduct that focus group if you deemed it appropriate and not a conflict of interest of any kind, of course. I am currently badged at Florence McClure, so that issue sort of gets taken off the table in terms of being able to enter that facility. Of course, I would follow any and all protocols that Director Daniels and NDOC has in place. It's just a thought to include the voices of as many people who are incarcerated as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Daniels, you had at least 2 commissioners express an interest under appropriate conditions to observe a town hall and perhaps, as Dr. Salisbury mentioned a moment ago, raise some questions or participate directly in the town hall. If you would rather think about that and discuss it later, we can do that. If you have a reaction or comment now, that would be welcome too. And I don't want to pin you down when you haven't had a chance to think about what some constraints are that you have to work through.
Thank you. I believe the first question or the first issue regarding town halls was for someone to come in and sit in or watch or listen to my town hall. I didn't see it as being participatory. Secondly, I'm wondering what the expectation would be if you're town halling inmates on what they would say about wanting to leave and go home. I hear that every time I go out. They all want to go home. They tell me. So I know that would be an issue. Nonetheless, it is, well, I don't have any issue with the transparency of having people come in, watch what we do. I thought that's what the intent of it was. Hey, come in, listen, critique it any way you would like. But to have inmates being questioned regarding their desire to go home and or whether or not they're afraid, I know the answer. So anyway, I'm going to reserve further comment on that, but I think it's important to put that out there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Were we able to get this Assemblywoman Nguyen back on?
I think, are you back, Assemblywoman Nguyen?
Assemblywoman Nguyen, are you back on the meeting? Okay. And Senator Canizero had to drop off.
Yes, she had to.
All right. Okay, so let me ask this. Clearly, the topic of the safer recommendations, will be on the Commission's next agenda, so that we can continue our conversation with respect to the recommendations that are contained in the safer plan. Secondly, I've asked Chief Carpenter to share with the group, if she could, some more granular information about the 398 or so individuals who are in the already paroled category. And so that the Commission can get a better sense of what that group looks like, what their conditions are, and what the challenges are for matching them up with a release. And we can further vet that at the April 29th meeting as well. I don't know whether there are any motions that anyone wishes to make at this meeting, but I want to afford people an opportunity to make any motion they want to make at this point on any topic that's been discussed under this category. And if not, then we will move on to the last segment of public comment. And Ms. Gonzalez has advised me that there is somewhere in the category of 12 or 13 additional public comments that have been received that we need to work through at the tail end of the meeting. So that said, is there any commissioner who, at least at this point, wants to make any motion on the SAFER plan or the topics related to it?
Justice Hardesty, this is Emily Salisbury. I wonder if we should make a motion to recommend that the pardon board meet. Do you feel that we need to have a motion on that?
I think if we're going to develop some kind of in tandem review of this subject, and the sooner the better, because right now, I think as mentioned before, the Pardons Board doesn't meet until I think it's June. Let me just check that, but I think that's their next meeting, and that agenda is largely going to be immunity and maybe a few inmate cases. Let me just check 1 second. Let's get that date. So it would be up to the governor to convene the board sooner than when that's scheduled. Let me just check that date here. Yes, Pardons Board is scheduled to meet on June 17th at 9 o'clock.
Okay, then I would like to move that we recommend that we work in tandem with the Pardons Board, and that we recommend to them that they hold an emergency meeting on this topic.
I second that.
This is Christine Brady. I second that motion.
Thank you, Ms. Brady. Mr. Story got ahead of you, but you didn't hear it. So the motion is made by Dr. Salisbury and seconded by Mr. Story. And is there any discussion on the motion?
Jeff Galloway here, Justice Hardesty. So just clarification on the motion is for the Pardons Board to request the Pardons Board convene to look at those cases Chief Carpenter talked about, the 300 and some that have already been reviewed, or what's the purpose of convening the board? To come up with criteria for other inmates? I'm just trying to ask for clarification on the proposal.
Dr. Salisbury, you want to clarify the motion?
Yep, so to clarify, I move that we at least recommend to the Pardons Board that they hold an emergency meeting to continue the discussion of the SAFER plan and the items that we've discussed in this meeting today.
Mr. Story, does that comport with your second?
It does.
Any other discussion on the motion?
Justice Hardesty, this is Chris Hicks. I don't mean to belabor this meeting, but to ask that board to convene at our request when we don't even have a plan in place seems putting the cart before the horse. The Pardons Board's Board's mission is, or authority is, to consider people who are up for possible pardon. We don't even have we put nothing in place to make any suggestions to them. And again, not that I'm against proactivity, but we have no confirmed cases in any of our facilities. And so I respect very much the doctor's motion, but from a discussion standpoint, I'm struggling to see why we would ask those 9 members to pull together for a meeting when we don't even have anything to suggest to them. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion or comment on the motion?
This is Todd Story. It was my understanding, based on the earlier conversation that we had, Chairman Hardesty, Justice Hardesty, that the purpose in asking the Pardons Board to convene will get the staffs together organize the list of those who are eligible, who are on the list that was referenced earlier by Director Carpenter, so that a plan could be developed. Am I mistaken in that earlier conversation? Am I takeaway or understanding what that conversation entailed?
Can I jump in? This is Ann Carpenter. The people that I refer to, they are already granted parole, so the Pardons Board would not need to deal with those individuals. That's something different. The Pardons Board would deal with people that are currently incarcerated that have not seen the parole board or have not been granted parole.
I think to return to Mr. Story's comment, there's a threshold question. Does the Pardons Board have any interest, maybe interest is a poor term, but any willingness to get a report on what the Commission's been debating and direct its staff and its agencies to start developing information about this? It's going to take some time to organize that meeting in the first place. So this was really just to start that process as I understood it. It might very well be that the governor would be disinclined to convene the Pardons Board, or once convened after the Pardons Board members have heard some of the discussion here, that they are not interested in pursuing these alternatives because they deem it unnecessary. But it's at this juncture, they are a piece of the pie to determine releases if they're going to be considered. And to the chief's comment, the chief, I had understood that there might be, not that there's an interest in doing this, but there might be some of the folks on this list who might need relief from some of these conditions if they wanted it. Is that something that the Pardons Board would grant or not?
I don't think, I mean, there's a lot of different variables, and if you're talking about trying to relax statutory language, I don't know how that piece works, but for the most part, this population is waiting on something, and so the Pardons Board would not really be effective with this population that we're talking about.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other discussion from members of the commission?
This is Chuck Calloway again, Chairman Hardesty. I'm kind of siding with the comments made by Mr. Hicks. Without a clear definition of what offender segment we're looking at, and without a clear definition of what a vulnerable inmate is, and without a clear definition of what a compassionate release would be, these things that we've discussed today, to call the Pardons Board together to have discussion about this when we ourselves haven't really developed any clear definition or any clear path moving forward, I just don't see in my mind how I can support something like that.
Okay. Any other discussion among the members of the commission?
Yeah, this is John Aristota, Justice Hardesty. I would like the motion to go forward and ask the Pardons Board to convene, and then with a specific task over the next, 10 days or so until our next meeting, however, 2 weeks, that we all look at the SAFER plan as a base and see if we can't come together as a board at the next meeting and providing the definitions that Mr. Calloway was just discussing, with another, in all likelihood, lengthy meeting and lots of discussion. And then we'd have something to submit to the Pardons Board after the next meeting.
Any other discussion on the motion?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman Hardesty. So is that a new motion that was just made, or are we still on the original motion?
We're on the original motion. All right. Hearing no further discussion, we'll take the roll.
All right, Mr. Aristota?
Yes.
Chief Carpenter? On the motion?
I'm sorry, can you say the motion one more time?
Yes, the motion before the commission is to request the Pardons Board to convene an emergency meeting to discuss, to begin discussions about what issues were raised and discussed at today's meeting of the commission.
I vote yes.
Mr. Logan?
Vote no.
Mr. Marsh?
Yes.
Mr. McCormick?
Yes.
Ms. Mull?
I vote no.
Dr. Neighbors? Mr. Ponder?
I vote no.
Dr. Salisbury?
Vote yes.
Mr. Story?
Yes?
Dr. Tyler Gardner?
Yes.
Assemblywoman Wynn?
Yes.
Vice Chair Callaway?
I'm a no.
Dr. Neighbors, are you there? Did I miss anybody else other than Chair Hardesty? All right, Chair Hardesty.
Yes.
I have 8 noes and 10 yeses.
All right, thank you. Let's turn to public comment. And I would ask if the staff could send everybody an email with the public comment.
Staff has sent that email. If you are having issues opening up the items, please let me know and reply to me directly, and I will send those to you individually. I will count again. I believe there's 14 items. And some of them are amendments to, they've been labeled based on what number of a comment they've been associated with. And so there might be an amendment in there to a comment from public comment earlier.
I'm sorry, this is John Aristota. What time were those sent at?
I just sent them.
Okay.
Yeah, mine just arrived.
It has quite a few attachments. Mr. Aristota, did you receive them?
I have. I'm going through them now, thanks.
Oh, great.
I just now got mine.
This is Darren Emily. I still have not.
Okay, I just sent a couple of them individually to you, Mr. Emily. And then, Mr. Logan, you say they were working for you?
I did just get them, yes.
Okay, great.
Public comment on I haven't received in my reply.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ponder.
Public comment number 13 is from Tonya Brown.
Justice Hardesty?
Yes?
I'm being asked by some people whether or not the results of that vote and are going to be listed somewhere public, or are they just going to be in the minutes?
Just be in the minutes.
Okay, thank you.
That's a roll call, so the roll call is in the minutes, yeah. Public comment number 15 is from Cindy Hufford, an email. Also listed as public comment number 15 is another email comment regarding Cindy Alford. And then public comment 15 revised is additional comments covering issues involving meals, hand sanitizer, video visits, and inmate calls from Cindy Alford. Comment 16 is from Tara Zimmerman. Comment 19 is also from Cindy Alford.
Hello?
Yes? Hello, does somebody have a comment?
Sorry, I lost, my phone died, so I'm calling in from another line. Thank you.
Okay. Public comment 18 is from Nicole Tate. Public comment 17 is from Elodie Hutchinson. And then public 14, which was a little out of order on our email list, is from Christina Veldveld. Yes, Ms. Hardesty, this is John Ernstad. I've been through, I believe, all of the public comments now, and they all seem to primarily apply to individual people serving sentence and with some policy within that. Generally speaking, that's true. I think Ms. Alford raises questions about the prison's policies. But I think generally speaking, that is a fair characterization, yes.
May I ask, is it appropriate to have some context for Ms. Alford's comment? Or a preliminary response or thoughts about it from our director?
Yes, of course.
Director Daniels, are you able to open Ms. Alford's comment? I believe it's public comment number 15, revised.
Okay, so they're asking about her public comments that she has defined to your life.
Hi, this is Director Daniels. I'm looking at 2 and 2, 3, tab 5. Did you want me to address each of the 5 by Ms. Well, it says from Cindy?
Ms. Alford.
Ms. Alford?
I was wondering if you had any context for it. I know you referenced earlier that everyone was being afforded the benefit of longer calls in lieu of suspending the visitation. These may be noting an equity issue around the cost of calls, as well as concerns about availability of food. Given your diligence with this effort, I thought you might have some context or comments in response to the concerns that she's noting.
Okay, so let me just go ahead and answer them as I grab them. I was out of the room for a moment, had to go relieve myself for a moment, so I apologize if I missed something. As it relates to the price of the inmate calls was not reduced. It's, what we did, we offered 2 free phone calls. Each of those phone calls were up to 30 minutes, and that's what we had offered each inmate. Is that what I'm responding to?
Yes, are those calls free or do they pay for them?
Yeah, well, they pay for the phone calls normally. However, we give them 2 free phone calls.
So they're
I'm just trying to answer this. Do the inmates pay for telephone calls? Yes. However, do we give them 2 free phone calls? Yes. Those 2 free phone calls will each up to a half hour.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. So the next one, it says, hand sanitizer has been taken away from all inmates, and that had been provided to because inmates drinking it. My fiance at NSC never received any and has never been made available under supervision. The first portion about the hand sanitizer, it was taken away. Why? Because we had several inmates purchase it from other inmates, and part of what's inside of the sanitizer is alcohol. Several of the inmates chose to reduce multiple bottles so that they could be drunk, but it also caused them to get high, to be sick. We knew that when we issued this initially, that this was a potential issue. This happened on the very first day. So then what we decided to do is that we have our staff go around with the cart, and they have a large tube of the sanitizer, and they just make rounds in the housing unit and ensure each inmate is able to get a couple of pumps or glumps, as they would call them. The inmates are able to get that, and we make multiple rounds a day. But the general issuance of bottles of sanitizer proved to be ill-informed. I actually made the decision because I was aware that this could be an issue. I said, let's give it a shot. And it wasn't within the first 6 hours in which we had our first 2 guys get drunk. So, all right, I gave it a shot. I've now changed my decision. So that is actually true in that particular issue. Are there any further questions about that?
No, thank you.
Okay, the next issue, let me read it here. My fiance put in a packet for us to be married back in February and has not been contacted by the chaplain. We're hoping that the steps to approve our marriage would be taken during this time so that once the quarantine is lifted, we would be able to be married without delay. Also, my visitation application was sent in February and have not received any response. It would be wonderful to know that when this all clears, I wouldn't have to wait longer to visit my fiance. Are you able to get or keep these processes moving forward? I can't speak for what's on the agenda for my chaplain right now, but I will have this looked into. I will communicate with my deputy director that handles programs. That's Mr. Brian Williams, and I'll have him assess that thing as he supervises the chaplain. Why have inmate, this is the next one, why have inmate meals been reduced so drastically? Yesterday for breakfast, my fiance received 1 egg and a small scoop of oatmeal. Today was 1 egg and 2 sausage links. He says all meals have been significantly reduced. I would push back on that, as inmates would of course obviously like to have as much as they would want to eat. But our meals are consistent with national guidelines. We have a nutritionist that has planned our meals, and we are fairly consistent with the amount of caloric intake as well as the nutrient intake. And we looked at that over a period of a day, over the 3 meals per day. In addition to that, our chief medical officer, which is Dr. Manev, the statewide chief medical officer has also been involved in determining and reviewing what we provide inmates for the meal.
Thank you for your comment.
Okay, now the next question is there any plan to allow video visiting until this clears up? This once again is from Cindy Alford. The answer is no. We typically have the capability to be able to facilitate meetings such as attorney-client meetings to the courts, things of that nature, but we don't have enough to facilitate visitation. But once again, the inmates are able to call, and then secondly, they're certainly able to write letters. Let me see if there's any more. What about the,
Those were specific.
okay.
I think we're covered, Director.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a canvass to see if everyone has had an opportunity to read the public comment that was circulated. Mr. Arascata?
Yeah.
Vice Chair Calloway?
Yes.
Chief Carpenter? Chief Carpenter?
Yes, sir.
Director Daniels?
Yes, I'd like to make one clarification on something I stated earlier, and I conflated 2 issues. There was a question regarding the copay for the inmates and us waiving them. The copays are specific to COVID-19, not all of the copays. And I do believe in my haste, I believe I indicated that it was for all things medical. That was completely inaccurate, and I apologize. It was very specifically for copays that are specific to COVID-19.
Okay, thank you, Director. Chairman Dorico, have you had a chance to look at the public comment?
I have, thank you.
Mr. Hicks?
I have.
Mr. Imlay?
Yes.
Ms. Jones-Brady?
Yes.
Mr. Logan?
I have, sir.
Mr. Russell, Mr. Marsh, I'm sorry.
That's fine, yes, I read them.
Mr. McCormick?
Yeah, I read them.
Ms. Mull?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Neighbors? Mr. Ponder?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Salisbury?
Yes, I have, thank you.
Mr. Story?
Yes, thank you.
Dr. Tyler Garner?
Yes, thank you.
Assemblywoman Nguyen?
Yes, I did.
Senator Canizaro? And Senator Picker, I think he had dropped off earlier. Okay. All right, that brings us to the end of our agenda. Let me first make a couple of comments. I'd like to express my sincere thanks and appreciation to Director Daniels, to Chief Carpenter, and to Chairman DeRico for their presentations here today. They have been thought-provoking, informative, and I think the citizens of the state of Nevada can be very proud of the proactive efforts that these public servants have made in protecting the staff of the prisons, the inmates who are in there, those who they supervise, and I really sincerely appreciate it. Once again, I think, frankly, your efforts illustrate that Nevada has undertaken best practices in many of these areas and provides a leadership role in terms of how one should address such a problematic and difficult problem. So you have my thanks and appreciation for your leadership and your effort, and I'm confident from the comments you've heard that you also have the thanks and appreciation of all of the members of the commission and the citizens of our state. I'd also like to thank all of the commission members for their heartfelt, thoughtful contributions to today's meeting. Everybody's input has been thought-provoking and significant to a very complex and difficult issue that faces us and many other states. I want to congratulate the sheriffs who have made efforts to address the same situations in their jails. And so, Chief Calloway, if you would convey our thanks and appreciation to Sheriff Lombardo, and Mr. Hicks, if you would do the same to Sheriff Phelan, we would appreciate it. We have a lot to talk about on April the 29th. We will continue our conversations forward. And I really thank everybody for your extended hours today and the work that you're doing on behalf of the Sentencing Commission. Thank you all. We are adjourned, and we'll see you again on the 29th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.